Hey, what's up everyone? Welcome back to the channel. This is Smart TCG, and today I'm going to be going over my post-EUIC Pokemon TCG tier list. Now, with the European International Championships just concluding, I think it would be a good day to go over some of the most popular decks and kind of where they rank right now in the tier list. I know that I most recently just did a top 10 deck list, but today I'm going to be going over a little bit more in depth about each one and where they kind of rank in the tiers. We have tier S. This is going to be labeled as the best of the best decks in format, decks that are going to be consistently winning tournament after tournament. We have tier 1, which is still fantastic decks. You're going to be seeing them top cutting, doing well, winning tournaments all the time. And then tier 2 is going to be strong decks, but with some flaws, but definitely can perform at a high level. And then we also have tier 3 as well. Tier 3 is going to be decks that are okay, but more or less moving towards that rogue-ish type level. And then we have rogue, which are going to be more rogue type decks, just in general, more fun decks, not necessarily super strong. I don't think there's going to be very many lists that are actually in that rogue tier, but yeah, anyways, let's get into it. Hopping into our list here, we're going to start off with Goodra Arceus. Now, I did say that we're probably not going to have many rogue decks. This one kind of teeters between tier 3 and also rogue. I think we'll put it in tier 3 just because it's Arceus. Arceus is still a very, very strong card, especially with Goodra. Incredibly simple strategy. Being able to pretty much accomplish your strategy every single game is what makes this deck viable. So I think it does deserve its spot in tier 3. Moving on, we have Arceus Giratina. Now, Arceus Giratina is a very strong deck in format, most recently performing relatively well at the most recent European International Championships. There were a couple in top 32, 64, and 128, so the deck is still proving itself to be relatively good. Judge Path is still one of the most powerful strategies in the game. Decks like Mew VMAX utilize that strategy to great effect to be able to consistently top cut tournaments, and this deck pretty much does the exact same thing, but just with different Pokemon, being able to use that Star Birth to be able to, build up your board state, and then use Trinity Nova to power up Giratina V-Star to be able to use that loss impact turn after turn. You're unfortunately not necessarily able to use Star Requiem, as you don't really have Colress's Experiments or things like Lost Vacuum to be able to get up to 10, so you're mostly just going to be using Starbirth as your V-Star power. All right, with that being said, I think this deck is solid tier 2. Judge Path, incredibly powerful. We have Dialga. Now, Dialga is a quite interesting deck as of right now. It's been performing okay in mostly online tournaments, but hasn't necessarily shown its face to be a contender at, in real life tournaments. Now, we do have Portland and Hartford regionals coming up, so that could definitely change things, but as of right now, its placements just aren't very, very strong. I think also the biggest issue with it right now is just consistency in general. It's not necessarily able to hit Star Chronos turn 2 as much as it would like, and that's pretty much what it needs to stay a top tier deck. So as of right now, I think we're going to put it at Rogue. If there was a way to make it so that it would hit turn 2 Star Chronos every single time, it would probably be in that tier 2 or tier 3-ish range. But as of right now, its consistency is really lacking, and it's not able to do it as much as you would like. Also, sometimes it can just get Giant Water Shuriken and blown out of the water, which is not great. So, or Moonlight Shuriken, not Giant Water Shuriken. It can just get Moonlight Shuriken out of the water by something like the Greninja, which is never fun, right? So anyways, Rogue-ish, it's okay. Anyways, moving on to some of the better decks in the format, we have Gardevoir. Now, Gardevoir is an interesting deck as of right now. I'm going to give you my opinions on it. There were just some, there were plenty of League Cups and League Challenges happening. I actually ended up playing this deck to one of my League Cups getting top 4. And have some opinions on it. It's incredibly good. The biggest issue is the Lost Zone Toolbox matchup. If it could just figure out that matchup and make it good, I think it would be by far the best deck in format. However, due to the fact that that matchup is just very, very sketchy right now, I think that Gardevoir is going to be in that tier 1 range. If that matchup was just better, or there was a way to consistently beat that matchup, then I do think that Gardevoir would be a tier S deck. But as of right now, the Lost Zone matchup really hinders it, and then it sometimes can struggle with consistency issues early on to where it loses to matchups that it probably necessarily shouldn't be losing to. But overall, once it gets set up, it is the best deck in format. Once it gets completely rolling, it is incredibly difficult to beat, which is a big reason as to why I think it still is going to remain at that tier 1, the tier S range. It's kind of in the middle of tier 1 and tier S right now. It's really close to tier S, but just not there yet. We're gonna need to see some more consistent performances by it before I can put it up there. But as of right now, I think it deserves its spot in that tier 1. So anyways, moving on to Goodra here. Goodra is a deck that performed fantastically at the European International Championships, doing exceptionally well, and I definitely think that it deserves its spot in that tier 2 range. It's almost a tier 1 as of right now. The biggest issue with this deck is 1, consistency, and 2, the Gardevoir matchup. Gardevoir is a deck that has seen so much play right now and is likely going to remain either the most played deck or the second most played deck heading into future tournaments, which is a big issue that this deck is, kind of running into, as that matchup is atrocious. As also decks like Lost Zone Giratina begin to do better at tournaments, that is also a big problem for Goodra, because heading into EUIC, there were decks like Duraludon, obviously we saw win the tournament. We're going to go over that deck as well. I know it's not necessarily on this list, but we'll put it up here for sure. But the big problem is that since Arceus Duraludon did well, and also the fact that Goodra did well, decks like Giratina are in theory going to become more popular, which are going to cause issues for decks like Goodra, as they don't do very well against those type of decks. However, if you can dodge decks like Giratina and Gardevoir, you have a chance to do really, really well in tournaments. Solid tier 2 deck. All right, moving on to Giratina Lost Zone Toolbox. This is a deck that's been getting a lot of talk as of right now. Very up and down. Some people are like, this deck is amazing. Some people are like, this deck is a meme. And I'm kind of indifferent on it. I think the deck is very, very powerful. However, it 1, struggles with consistency issues, and 2, struggles with the Lost Zone Toolbox matchup, which are some big issues right now, right? So that is kind of my concern as of right now with this deck. I think it's very good. But the problem is that if Lost Zone Toolbox, especially the turbo one, remains the most played version, I think it's going to run into some issues. So as of right now, I think it is a bottom tier 2 deck. I don't think it's better than most of the other tier 2 decks. However, I do think it deserves its spot on this list as a tier 2 deck. Now, if decks like Lost Zone Toolbox, for some reason, I don't think this is going to happen for quite some time, but if they start to lose popularity, then by all means, I think that we could possibly see this deck move up to tier 1. It can beat Gardevoir. It can beat pretty much anything. It doesn't necessarily take a whole lot of free matchups, except versus things like Duraludon and also decks like Goodra V-Star as well. All right. Moving on to Lugia. Now, in my most recent tier list that I actually just uploaded, I put it in tier S. I'm going to change that. I think that it is a tier 1 deck as of right now. I don't think it's the best deck in the format. I think it is a tier 1 deck. And the biggest issue with it is consistency. It consistently is not able to set up, in my opinion. Even when it does set up, it becomes very weak to cards like Roxanne and also Temple of Sinnoh combinations that decks like Goodra play and also decks like Gardevoir play. On top of it, it is a much more high risk, high reward deck, as it relies on cards like Capturing Aroma and also cards like Mezagoza to be able to set up. Your games will oftentimes be determined by whether or not you flip heads when you need heads, or you flip tails when you need tails. Oftentimes you'll run into situations where you flip tails when you need heads and heads when you need tails, so on and so forth. It's not very fun. However, when the deck gets fully set up, it's arguably the only deck in format that has an answer to literally every matchup. When it gets set up, it really can just beat anything, which is a big reason as to why I think that this deck does deserve its spot in that tier 1. It's close to tier S. Once it gains a little bit more consistency, then I think it could easily move back into tier S. If Quick Ball was still in format, slam dunk tier S deck. However, since it's not, obviously, then the deck is just a lot more RNG based, which causes issues for it. However, when it gets set up, it's absolutely fantastic tier 1 deck. All right, moving on to Mew VMAX. Mew VMAX is a deck that is performing quite well. We most recently saw Pablo Meza get top 4 at the most recent European International Championships with it, and I think it deserves its spot on this list. I think it deserves its spot in that tier 1. I think it's very, very good. Being able to use Fusion Strike system and just having arguably the most consistent engine in the game other than Gardevoir is very, very good. Being able to judge path is absolutely fantastic. You have relatively good matchups against most of the Arceus variants. You also are a deck that can just beat anything no matter how bad the matchup is off judge path, which is a big reason as to why this deck deserves its spot in that tier 1. However, the biggest issue with this deck that is holding it back from being the best deck in format is Drapion, and also the fact that if your opponents just set up correctly through judge path, your deck is inherently relatively weak. If you play against Lugia V-Star and they get out of the judge path and they go double Archeops, use Yveltal or Tyranitar, take KO, your deck's relatively mediocre. If you go against Gardevoir and they get completely set up, go Zacian, Sky Seal, Stone early game, or just develop a board state with tons of Kirlias, deck's relatively weak. However, the odds are in your favor that Judge Path or Boss Path or some version of Disruption is going to work on them at some point, which is a big reason as to why this deck is still very, very good. However, you always run that risk of not necessarily having control over games. None of your games you're really feeling like, okay, I have complete control over this game, there's nothing they can do. Because you run into those situations where you Fusion Strike energy or you Fusion Strike system into a bunch of cards that you can't necessarily burn, as cards like Quick Ball are non-existent anymore as they've rotated out of the standard format, and also you can just lose to random Drapion, Sky Seal Stones, or even just Drapion in general. So those are the big reasons as to why this deck is not best deck in format, because it doesn't have a whole lot of control over the outcomes of games. You're kind of just YOLOing it and hoping that it works. So as of right now, tier 1 deck still very, very good though, because the odds are technically in your favor. Decks like Trevnor, Gengar in the past were decks that were arguably the best deck in format, but technically if your opponent always drew out of the locks, they would beat you. Kind of the same thing with this, right? Although players always have an out against you, the odds are always going to be in your favor that they're not going to have that out. Tier 1 deck. Moving on to Miraidon here. We have this deck most recently got top 8 at EUIC. I think it's actually relatively okay. It is arguably the most consistent deck on this list, which is a big reason as to why I think it's better than some people think. It has a decent Lugia matchup. If you go second, you can get the turn 1 Raikou KO or Miraidon KO, which is really good. And you are arguably the most aggressive deck in format. However, you really struggle to one-prize decks, and if decks can get set up through that early game blitz that you're going to give them, then I think it can kind of run into some issues. So as of right now, I think it's at the very bottom of tier 2, maybe even top of tier 3. However, I think as time goes on, this deck has potential to be special. It really is consistent and is arguably the most aggressive deck in the format. I think it deserves its spot near on the bottom of tier 2. All right. Moving on, we got ourselves Lost Box Charizard. I think Lost Box Charizard is a middle of the pack tier 2 deck. I think it is strong. It's better than Giratina in my opinion. The biggest issue that it runs into is consistency. Its consistency is not great, which oftentimes can hurt its versus decks that it probably shouldn't be losing to. So as of right now, I think that it is a tier 2 deck. I think it's significantly weaker than the other 2 Lost Box variants. I wouldn't say significantly. I would say it's slightly weaker than one of the Lost Box variants, but significantly weaker against one of the other Lost Box variants. But as of right now, I think it's a solid tier 2 deck. The biggest problem, actually I'll say one more thing, the biggest problem is it doesn't have Radiant Greninja, so it oftentimes can struggle with consistency and becomes more weak to Rock Sand, so, and also Judge in general. So those are a couple things. All right, moving on to Lost Box Sky Seal Stone. I think Lost Box Sky Seal Stone is a tier 1 deck. I prefer the Sky Seal one technically over the Forest, as I really like having outs versus every deck in format, especially Mew VMAX and also the Lugia V-Star matchup. I think it helps out a lot in those matchups. Yes, it is a tiny bit more inconsistent. However, having Sky Seal Stone, even things like Zamazenta, I think are really, really good. Kind of have matchup adaptability versus pretty much everything, which is good. However, you do lose a little bit of consistency, whereas the Turbo Lost Box might be better in a best of 1 field. I think maybe the Sky Seal Stone, even with 1 Forest as well, I think you probably play a 1-1 split, is definitely really, really good. All right, moving into Turbo Lost Box. I think Turbo Lost Box is top of tier 2, bottom of tier 1. I think we'll put it at bottom of tier 1 as of right now. I think the deck is incredibly powerful, super consistent. The biggest issue that it always runs into is the Lugia V-Star matchup. Not being able to consistently handle cards like Stonejourner and Yveltal are a problem, whereas the Sky Seal box has more outs like Snorlax, Zamazenta, stuff like that. This one is more or less just Turbo trying to hit that turn 1 Raikou or Dragonite, or just being the most consistent deck in the room, which is a big reason as to why it is relatively strong right now. I think it's a bottom of tier 1 deck. It can pretty much beat everything. However, it's very linear, and the Lugia matchup is the one matchup that it really can struggle against. So as of right now, I think it's a bottom of tier 1 deck. I think it's very, very strong, especially good for League Cups and League Challenges as well. Moving on to Inteleon. I think Inteleon is actually pretty good. If you hit Lost Box decks, you're going to do great. However, if you don't hit Lost Box decks, you're not going to do great, which is a big reason as to why this deck, I think, is still a very, very strong deck. However, its matchup spread is not great against some of the top decks. Decks like Gardevoir, still not a great matchup. Decks like Lugia V-Star, one of the worst matchups that it has, as if they go V-Guard and attach, or if they go V-Guard, and you get put into situations where Rabbit Urshifu does like 90 damage. So that's a big issue with it as of right now, is that you don't necessarily do a whole lot of damage to arguably one of the best decks in format. You can also struggle with consistency. You are also a VMAX deck, but it does have good matchups against some of the smaller things in the format. So as of right now, I think it deserves its spot in the tier 2. It's still good though. All right. Thank you so much, Omnipoke, as well, for providing this tier list. I appreciate it. It makes it a lot easier for me. I was able to look it up, so shout out to them. Anyways, with that being said, this is my tier list. Big thing on this list, no tier S decks. I think everything is good. There's nothing overwhelmingly great. It's important, I think, to recognize in this metagame. But anyways, if you enjoy the content, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. Let me know what you think of the tier list. Let me know if you agree. But with that being said, thank you so much for watching. I appreciate all the support as always. I'll have some more Scarlet and Violet gameplay coming up over the next couple days. But yeah, thanks for all the support as always. This is Smart TCG, and I'll speak with you again soon. Peace out, everyone. If you're interested in improving your game, I do offer coaching on Metafy. I'm one of the most successful players in the entire world, ranked in the top 20 worldwide, and I know what it takes to get there. If you're just interested about learning what coaching is, I do also have a free consultation where we can kind of go over exactly how I coach, like some of the plans that might be best for you and what we need to do moving forward to make sure that you are as successful as possible. Just is going to be kind of a time for us to get to know each other and kind of go over exactly what coaching is. But I have all of my sessions here along with training plans, and if you have any more questions, don't hesitate to shoot me a message on Metafy or any of my socials below. But just wanted to put that out there. If you are interested in improving your game, I do offer coaching on Metafy, and if you have any questions, anything like that, all those links will be in the description. All right, thank you so much.